As we wrap up our week, and indeed our school year, let's do one more story from Dr. Seuss. This one's a bit of a big one, so we're going to have to do it in two parts. And it's called The King's Stilts. Do you know what stilts are? In Spanish, the word is zancos. They're these big wooden poles that you stand on, and they help you look tall. Well, this is about a king who had a pair of stilts and a little boy who helped him out. Here we go. The King's Stilts by Dr. Seuss. Naturally, the king never wore his stilts during business hours. When King Bertram worked, he really worked, and his stilts stood forgotten in this tall stilt closet in the castle's front hallway. There was so much work to be done in the kingdom of Ben that King Bertram had to get up every morning at 5. Long before the townsfolk and the farmers were awake, the king was splashing away in his bath. It was right there, in fact, that his day's work began. With his left hand he could bathe with his royal bath brush, but his right hand he always had to keep dry for signing the important papers of state. Eric, his page boy, brought in these papers on a big silver tray. He stood at attention at the foot of the tub, while old Lord Droon took the papers one by one and held them over the water for His Majesty to sign. "Sign here, sign there," old Droon would say. "And hurry, sire, hurry. There are hundreds more to come." It was just the same at breakfast. The king cut and buttered his toast with only his left hand. With his right, he kept signing royal orders and commands. By 7 every morning, the king had always finished more business than most kings do in a month. He had to get all this done before 7, for that was the hour when his big work commenced, the most difficult and important work in the whole kingdom of Ben. This was the work of caring for the mighty dike trees that protected the people of Ben from the sea. The sea pushed against the kingdom on 3 sides. The kingdom was a low one. The sea was a high one. And only the dike trees kept the sea from pouring in. They grew so close together in a row along the shore that they held back the water with their heavy, knotted roots. To keep those trees strong and sturdy was not an easy task. They were more spicy than pine trees, and their roots were very tasty to a certain sort of bird. This was a kind of giant blackbird with a sharp and pointed beak. Nizzards, they were called by the people of Ben. These nizzards were always flying about over the dike trees, waiting for a chance to swoop down and peck. If nobody stopped them, the roots would soon give way. Then the sea would pour in with a terrible roar, and every last soul in the kingdom would drown. But King Bertram did not permit this to happen. He had gathered together in his kingdom the largest and the smartest cats in all the world, and had trained them to chase the nizzards away. These cats were called patrol cats, and wore badges that said PC. "Everything in Ben," said King Bertram, "depends on our patrol cats. They are more important than our army, our navy, and our fire department too, for they keep the nizzards away from the dike trees, and the dike trees keep the ocean back out of our land." 1,000 cats in all. They divided up the work. 500 guarded the kingdom by day. The other 500 kept watch through the night. At 7 every morning came the changing of the cat guard. At the sound of a trumpet, the king left his breakfast and mounted his horse for the daily review. Fresh, brisk, and well-fed, the 500 day cats marched past him toward the dike trees to take up their watch. At the same time, the night cats, muddy, tired, and hungry, headed home to their kennels for their 12 hours rest. There was rest for the cats, there was none for the king. It took every minute of his morning to see that they were given the very best of care. The huts that they slept in must be kept clean and tidy. Each cat must be brushed, and his whiskers trimmed just so. The cat kitchen was even bigger and grander than the king's, and the cooks who did the cooking were the chief cooks in the land. Your Majesty, chief in charge of fish would always say, tell us what you think the food we feed our cats is perfect. And the king would look over the huge wet baskets of fish, choosing only the finest and the freshest to serve to his patrol cats. So went the morning. Then, all afternoon, both in winter and summer, the king made his rounds by the edge of the sea. Every root of every dike tree he inspected every day. But finally, at 5 o'clock, the great task was finished. Then the king smiled. A hard day, he'd say, full of nizzardly worries. A long day, he'd say. Now it's time for some fun! This was the moment King Bertram lived for. When he worked, he really worked. But when he played, he really played. Eric, he'd shout. Eric, the stilts! Down the slope from the dike trees, away from all troubles, the king and Eric would race like two boys, straight to the tall stilt closet in the castle's front hallway. Out came the stilts, up leapt the king. High in the air, his royal robes streaming, he'd race through the marble halls, out across the terrace, up and down the garden stairs. Black-spotted coach dogs barked and romped beside him, nipping at the heels of his flashing red stilts. The townsfolk looked on from the walls and just loved it. A grown-up king on stilts, they'd say, does look rather strange. But it's hard work being king, and he does his work well. If he wants to have a bit of fun, sure, let him have it. There was one man in Bin who didn't like fun. He didn't like games. He didn't like laughing. This man was a scowler. This man was Lord Droon. Laughing spoils the shape of the face, he declared. The lines at the corner of the mouth should go down. Every afternoon, when the stilt hour drew near, Lord Droon would slink away to his room in the northwest tower and sulk. Such carryings on, he would mutter in disgust, as he spied on the king from his window. Look at his crown, bouncing up and down on the side of his head. Look at his beard, flapping in the wind. Look at him laughing, right out in broad daylight in front of the townsfolk. I must do something about this. And one day, he did. One Wednesday, just before supper, when he thought the king was out, Lord Droon tiptoed down to the front hall. The guards, at their posts, were dozing. Without the smallest sound on the hard stone floor, Droon crept to the stilt closet, pulled back the ancient door, and reached in. It took only a second. He had the king's stilts. He unbuttoned the top of his long robe and shoved them down inside. Then he sneaked past the guards again and slipped through the door. Down the steep, slanting stairway, Lord Droon marched with the stilts, down to the furnace to burn them. This is the end of the king's foolish stilt walking, he mumbled to himself. Then suddenly, from around the bend of the stairs, came the sound of happy whistling. The king! Lord Droon stopped still, almost frozen with fright. He tugged and pulled at his long flowing gown, struggling to cover the stilts, but he couldn't. The ends were too long and stuck out. "Droon! Droon!" gasped Lord Droon. "You'll be caught!" He turned and fled back up the stairway. Nearer and nearer came the king, but Droon couldn't climb any faster. The stilts clattered. They banged and spanked against his knees. He looked up and saw a window. Stepping up to it quickly, he poked his head out. He looked down into an alley. A small boy was passing. It was Eric, the page boy. "Psst! You! Lord Droon hissed in a hoarse, nervous whisper. Eric looked up, astonished. "Yes, sir." He bowed politely. "Take these stilts," commanded Lord Droon. "Take them away. Bury them. Deep, where no one can ever find them. Bury them up by the sea, by the dike trees." Lord Droon flung the stilts from the window. King's stilts! Bury them? Eric didn't know what to think. It will spoil all His Majesty's fun, he stammered. "You're impudent," said Lord Droon harshly. "I said bury those stilts. What's more, young man, don't you ever come back, or I'll have you locked up. I have no impudent boy around this castle." But I'm the king's own page boy, gasped Eric, hardly able to understand this dreadful command. "You were the king's own page boy," snapped Lord Droon. He pulled in his head and slammed down the window. Never before had Eric been so puzzled. Never in his life had he felt so sad. But there was nothing to do but obey the command. He picked up the stilts and walked straight toward the road that led to the sea. It was the hour that the townsfolk were all having supper. Nobody saw him dig the deep hole. Nobody saw him bury the stilts. At 5 the next morning, the halls of the castle echoed the king's mournful shouts. "Droon! Droon! They're gone! They're gone!" The king stood groping in the empty stilt closet, hopelessly searching for what wasn't there. Lord Droon chuckled to himself. He had expected this to happen, and was ready with his lie. "It was the townsfolk who did it," he said, peering into the stilt closet and pretending to be greatly shocked. "I have seen them every day, plotting behind the castle walls. A king, they say, should behave like a king, and sit with pomp and dignity upon his royal throne. A king, they say, should never walk on stilts. It's too bad, Your Majesty, but you must try to do without them." King Bertram answered with a heartbroken sigh. "Well, I'll try to do without them." But he couldn't. Day after day he grew sadder and sadder. For long hours he'd just sit, idly drumming with his fingers on the arms of his throne. He couldn't keep his mind on his work. His commands to the patrol cats sounded feeble and faint. The cats seemed to know it, and wouldn't obey. Day by day they grew lazier and lazier. Uncombed and unbrushed, they slept most of the day and grew fat. Nobody bothered to put their PC badges on them, for as chasers of nizzards, they weren't worth a thing. Day by day the nizzards grew bolder and bolder. They cackled and fluttered over the dike trees. They flew down and almost seemed to sneer at the lazy, sleeping cats. Ooh, what will Eric do? Will he be able to get the king his stilts back? Will he be able to help him? And what about Droon? Do you think he's going to just stand there and let this happen? Well, if you want to know more, you're going to have to come back next week to find out, because we are out of time. So, yep, that's all we have. So, goodbye, and I'll see you, hopefully, next week.